Welcome. The following story comes from a small, leather-bound Franklin library book entitled INISHAIRLACH, circa 1835, that includes the 4 tales of INISHAIRLACH: The Miller of Corbeil, Brambletie House, and The Way to be Happy. We hope that you enjoy, and please let us know your thoughts in a comment below.
The Miller of Corbeil. In rural landscape, the French are generally apt to prefer the beautiful to the sublime. The scenes by savage Rosa dashed are not near so much to their fancy as those which learned Poussin drew, and the Lakeland Valley, conceitedly described by Avison as beauty lying in the lap of horror, would have filled their souls with consternation. They love a scene whose very surface bears the promise of corn, wine, and oil, a land flowing with milk and honey, a Canaan which borrows no enhancements from the picturesque. The very rocks of the royal forest of Fontainebleau, described by Francis I as mes désirs, are regarded by the Parisians as terrific rather than as constituting an element of beauty in a woodland landscape. And a smiling scene, more especially the scenery of ces riants coteaux de la Seine, affords the greatest attractions to the badauds or cockneys of the French metropolis. For this reason, Corbeil is a favorite spot with them. Corbeil, with its fertile and vine-crowned banks rising above the Seine, uncontaminated by the pollutions poured forth thereafter into its glassy waters by a filthy capital. Corbeil, which, as Boulogne is termed the fat, might assuredly be called the mealy. Corbeil, whose villas line the shore with their well-trimmed avenues of limes, and here and there a shrub dipping down into the stream to shelter the baths constructed by the divers proprietors in the bed of the river. The prosperous little town is neither so ornate in its environs as Richmond, nor so stately in its domiciles as Hampton Court, but the wooded heights of Saint-Germain rise majestically above its suburbs, and, if a palace be lacking, it boasts an edifice still more unique and almost as imposing, the celebrated Mill of Corbeil. The antiquarian, too, finds ample employment for his researches. On the outskirts of the town, and sloping to the edge of the Seine, lies the Plaisance of the Tremblay, the summer palace of Queen Blanche of happy memory, still sending up its bubbling springs with as crystalline a grace as when the stone fonts, in which they are still contained, formed the bath of sovereign beauty, but devoting those lofty walls, once the precincts of a court, to the humbler but more useful purpose of ripening some 100-weight of Chasselas grapes for a market gardener. Yet, although thus strangely degraded in its destinations, and having its level lawns variegated with sundry patches of oats, wheat, barley, rye, Indian corn, lucerne, French beans, and vines, according to the agricultural propensities of the cultivator, whose fertile farm is bounded by those lofty walls and entered by the stately gateways that afforded access to royalty itself, the Tremblay retains many a scattered relic of former grandeur. Like a waiting gentlewoman, retired from service to live upon her means in her native village, and occasionally stealing to church in a suit of paduasoy manufactured from the court train of her former lady, here and there, in the midst of a vineyard or corn ridge, we fall upon the ornamented basin of a fountain that plays no longer, or stumble against a stone bench half hidden among the shoots of the beech tree, under whose shade it formerly afforded a resting place to the noble saunterers of the palace. The very canal still shelters among its flowering flags and water lilies a few overgrown golden carp, glittering among the more sober-suited fishes of its waters like the last courtiers of the place. For Queen Blanche and her successors were, in turn, succeeded at her Plaisance of the Seine by nobles of high degree, nor was it until the last century that it fell into plebeian hands. It happened, however, that at the period immediately preceding the frightful epoch of the French Revolution, the Tremblay had brighter things to boast of than its golden carp, purer things than even its crystal fountains. The little farm, concealed within its cosy nook, was tenanted by a worthy wight named Mathurin, whose 2 daughters enjoyed the envied appellation of the Roses of Corbeil. It is impossible to conceive 2 lovelier creatures, or 2 more closely resembling each other in person, more thoroughly dissimilar in character and disposition. There was but a year's difference between them in age, there was a century's in sentiment. Manette, the elder sister, was a light, lively, gay-hearted creature, riant as the landscapes of Corbeil. Justine, the younger, with the same blue eyes, the same silken hair, the same trim ankle and well-formed figure, was sad and sober, and the neighbours, who noted among themselves her gravity of aspect, were apt to attribute it to the influence of the broken constitution of her mother, who died of a pulmonary disorder in giving her birth. Both sisters, however, by the discretion of their deportment, strengthened the high distinctions attained by their beauty, and Mathurin, although watchful over the 2 nymphs of the Tremblay, as a miser over his gold, was not afraid to let his daughters take their stand on market days upon the Place de Notre-Dame of Corbeil, with their fair faces shaded by the wide straw hats in use among the peasants of the department of the Seine-et-Oise, to preside over the sale of the vegetable produce of his farm, and more especially over the stand of garden flowers and exotics, the pride of the gay parterre surrounding the limpid bath of the Reine Blanche. Everything prospered with them. While the father busied himself with the cares of his farm, the daughters contrived to render it available. The barley mow and the hayrick diminished. The beds of ranunculuses and tulips were bereft of their brilliant show. But Mathurin's long leathern purse grew heavier, his linen press was stocked, and at length he took his pipe at even as well as morning tide without much self-reproach on the score of economy. He even made the girls partakers of his gains, and Justine had the happiness to secure from her earnings a weekly mass for the spiritual repose of her mother at the altar of the Sacré-Cœur in the church of Saint-Spire. Manette, however, had other objects to which to devote her superfluous wealth. Manette was young and pretty enough to be curious in the lace of her pinners and the lawn of her kerchief. It was observed one day, as she took her usual stand on the market-place, that she exhibited a pair of long gold earrings under her straw hat, and that a cross of gold was suspended to the black velvet which habitually encircled her slender throat, and 1 or 2 of the most censorious of the ladies of the Faubourg, who were accustomed to exchange a few civil words with the Roses of Corbeil, while they laid in their stock of mignonette seed, turned disdainfully away when they noticed this accession of finery. Mademoiselle Benoît, indeed, the squint-eyed daughter of a retired notary at Saint-Germain, was heard to whisper that it was no wonder Manette of Le Tremblay grew so fine, now that she was rowed over the river so often by young Monsieur Felix Clériveau of the 12 Moulins, and now that young Monsieur Clériveau of the 12 Moulins found the fountains of Le Tremblay so refreshing during the midsummer heats. The prudes and scandal-mongers were determined to espy mischief in the innocent coquetry of poor Manette. Felix was a man whom, if few people loved, most people feared, although in every way extrinsically endowed to win affection, and only qualified to excite apprehension by a sort of taciturn reserve, inspiring involuntary mistrust of his temper and disposition. He was chargeable with no act of violence, no act of injustice. He was charitable, generous, humane, yet his associates, one and all, refrained from making him their friend, and from the singular motive that they felt convinced he was capable of becoming a bitter enemy. And thus it was that few people loved Felix. He was the son of old Clériveau, the rich Miller of Corbeil, but he was nothing more. The mill, or as it is called on the spot, the 12 Moulins of Corbeil, although no less a number than 28 are comprehended in the one huge building, resembling at a distance rather a strong fortress than a humble corn mill, was then a recent erection, one vast wing of the building being devoted to the government service of the public hospitals of Paris, the other to the private speculations of Clériveau. At a time when all other branches of commerce were declining, under the influence of the political dissensions already agitating the kingdom, when the rich silk weavers and bronze founders of Paris were beginning to foresee a term to their prosperity, the staff of life was not the less needed that its consumers were bent on establishing a general equalization of their rights. Bread was wanted at Paris, whether Girondin or Jacobin ruled the Senate, and old Clériveau, profiting by the facilities afforded by the vicinity of the river Juine to the spreading cornfields of La Brie towards the provisionment of the capital, had invested a large portion of his fortune in the creation of an establishment likely to perpetuate his name and multiply his means beyond all calculation. His whole life had, in fact, been spent in the task of money-getting and money-sparing, and the pastime of deceiving the world as to the extent of his gains and savings. No one, not even his only son, had the most remote idea of the amount of Clériveau's property. But when it was rumoured in Corbeil that he had made overtures for an alliance between Felix and Mademoiselle de Montigny, co-heiress of the Château de Saint-Port, the gossips of the town decided that he must be a bolder or a richer man than they had previously imagined. The aristocratic de prefixed to the name of the young lady being equivalent to the value of at least 30,000 crowns in a marriage contract with the son of the Miller of Corbeil. Neither the distinction it imparted, however, nor any other attraction sufficed to overcome the opposition of Felix to the match. While Mademoiselle Benoit and her crew were busy in computing what amount of wealth could justify the Clériveaux in pretending to so grand a connection, the young man explicitly declared to his father his determination to wed elsewhere. This might have been held sufficient provocation, but when Felix came to particularize that the partner he had chosen was no other than pretty Manette, the twin Rose of Corbeil, the gardener's daughter of Le Tremblay, the wrath testified by old Clériveau against his son was easy to be accounted for. The cast-off prejudices of the great usually descend to the little, and at a time when even the peerage of France was beginning to republicanize, when Versailles itself had declared in favor of the natural equality of the human species, it was time for the miller to disdain the inter-alliance of his family with that of a market gardener. Nor could an emperor of Germany, insulted by the determination of his son, the king of the Romans, to espouse the daughter of some petty baron of the empire, have shown himself more fiercely indignant than old Clériveau.
"I had already heard from our cousin Benoit,"
cried he,
"that it was inferred in the town no good would come of your everlasting visits to the sty of a farm yonder over the water. But look you, Master Felix, if ever again you set foot upon the turf of Le Tremblay, I will assuredly put the width of my threshold between you and me for evermore. Aye, sir, and marry again. Mademoiselle de Montigny, perhaps. Why not the father as well as the son? And beget sons and daughters, who shall not thwart me in my old age, although they share my inheritance with my elder and more stubborn child.
You cannot do better, sir, replied Felix. Although you deny my choice, I am far from inclined to find fault with yours. Marry Mademoiselle de Montigny, disinherit me if you will. I have still 2 strong arms and as strong a heart to enable me to get my own living and pursue my own inclinations.
And Clériveau, well aware of the obstinacy of his son's resolves, gave over the case for lost, and even made a solemn progress to the Château de Saint-Port to offer his apologies to the family of Montigny and tender the retraction of his proposals. Yet, in spite of this resignation and these formal measures, all hope of the alliance was not at an end. Aude Clériveau had an abettor in his projects, on whom he little calculated. He could not be more firmly determined that Felix should never become the husband of the gardener's daughter than Manette that she would never become the wife of the miller's son. No, it was not for him that she had added the offending trinkets to her costume, or folded the snowy lawn upon her bosom. It was not for him that she loitered by the way on the road from Le Tremblay to the marketplace. It was not for him that she ensconced her well-turned foot in slippers of Spanish Morocco to dance upon the green sward at the annual fête of Saint-Étienne at Essonne. There were other attractions at the Mill of Corbeil than the homage of Felix Clériveau, and Mathurin's daughter, so inaccessible to the addresses of one who wooed her with the stern gravity of a Spanish hidalgo, or rather with the jealous but impassioned tenderness of an Orosman, had given her heart, with very little asking, to young Valentin, the son of Charlet, the ferryman of Corbeil. As it has been already observed, the prejudices of the great are eagerly adopted by the little, and the rich miller could not express himself more vehemently against his son's attachment to the daughter of the market gardener than did the market gardener in his turn on hearing his daughter's engagement to the son of a poor ferryman of the Seine. Clériveau wished to marry Felix to the high-born Clarisse de Montigny, Mathurin to marry Manette to the wealthy Felix. Clériveau threatened to disinherit his son. Mathurin threatened to horsewhip his daughter. And when, on the evening succeeding the general éclaircissement, Felix rode over to Le Tremblay and, having fastened his boat to the usual stump, made his way towards a stone bench among the acacias, where, often at the same hour, he had found the 2 daughters of Mathurin sitting together, now talking, now listening, sometimes to each other, sometimes to the gurgling of the springs among the grass, or the whistling of the blackbirds in the groves of Saint-Germain. He was bitterly taxed by Manette with the indignities he had been the means of drawing upon her endurance.
"It is a cruel thing of you, Monsieur Felix,"
said she,
"to persist in persecuting me thus, after I have again and again told you that were you Count of Corbeil, or the King of France himself, I would never be your wife. And now you have provoked my father to misuse me, the first time he ever breathed a harsh word against either of his children. I do but detest you the more."
Hate me, and welcome,
said Felix in an unaltered voice.
I have heard you say as much before, Manette, and been nothing moved. But I never till today, never till from your father's lips this morning, did I learn that you preferred another, that you stooped to bestow the love denied to me upon yonder beggar, the son of a beggar, the hireling drudge of my father's mill. What in heaven, what on earth, do you see to move your affection in such a fellow as Valentin? Answer me, Manette. What do you see to like in Valentin?
That if he were rich like yourself, Monsieur Felix Clériveau, he would not be always thinking of riches and giving the name of beggar, as a word of reproach, to others less fortunate than himself. For Valentin has the heart of a prince.
Truly a ragged prince, and with a precious cabin for his palace,
retorted the miller's son, at once justifying her accusation.
as you will find when you take your place yonder in Charlet's hovel, among the 10 half-fed, half-clothed brats who call him father.
And who, even for that scanty food and scanty clothing, are indebted to the labour of Valentin.
Added Manette with firmness.
Of Valentin, who, when his work at the mill is over, comes back to his father's hut with a smile upon his face and a song upon his lips, and, instead of grumbling and murmuring that his limbs are aching with toil, sits down cheerfully to his osier weaving or mat work, or, during the summer season, rows off as stoutly as though his arms had not done a turn of work through the day, to cut reeds for the thatchers or the tile-makers. And for what does he labour? To lay up hoards for himself, or to purchase the means of selfish pleasure? No, Monsieur Felix, no. To get bread for his paralytic mother, raiment for his brothers and sisters, rent to requite your own purse-proud father for the use of the miserable hut you hold so cheap. Proud as you are of your fortune, your very means have been swelled by his industry.
Manette,
Whispered the gentle Justine, laying her hand imploringly upon her sister's shoulder.
you know not how great an injury you may be doing Valentin by this violence.
I understand you,
Replied Manette aloud.
although you are afraid to speak out. You mean that Monsieur Felix will be a powerful and malicious enemy to him. Courage, courage, sister. Valentin, by the sweat of his brow and the labour of his hands, earns wages from the Miller of Corbeil. But he is not therefore the slave of either old Clériveau or his son. There is nothing to fear for Valentin, nor any reason why I should not acquaint the gentleman, who is base enough to taunt him with beggary, that I would rather make one in the hovel by the riverside, among its merry inmates and the warm hearts that would welcome me so kindly, than play the lady in the cold, narrow-minded family of Clériveau, where the only cheerful sound is the clack of their own mill.
By this time, the soul of Felix was overflowing with rage. He ground his teeth for rage as he thought of Valentin. But he uttered not a syllable. His wrath was silent as it was deadly, and the stillness was only interrupted by the sobs of Manette, whose petulance, as usual, exhausted itself in tears.
"Father!"
cried she, suddenly starting up from Justine's pacifying embraces as the footsteps of Mathurin were heard approaching the bench on which they sat.
"I beseech you, command Monsieur Felix Clériveau to quit this place. You explained to me this morning the wickedness of children presuming to disobey their parents. You will not, surely, encourage a son to rebel against his father. Old Clériveau has laid his injunctions on Felix to visit Le Tremblay no more. You have pride too, father. Surely, surely you will not stoop to have it said that you laid snares to seduce a raw, inexperienced boy into marriage with your daughter."
And who will dare to say so?
Ejaculated the young man, trembling with repressed rage at the epithets bestowed upon him.
"Your own kinswoman, Mademoiselle Benoît, has said so 1,000 times.
Mademoiselle Benoît is an accursed fool,
cried old Mathurin, and young Clériveau saw no cause to dispute the assertion.
But you cannot, surely, my dear father, wish Monsieur Felix to get into trouble by his visits to Le Tremblay,"
said Justine mildly, a question to which the gardener-farmer found it so difficult to reply that he leaned down on pretext of caressing the shaggy-looking cur which was accustomed to lag at his heels rather than venture on a direct answer.
And how is my father to hear of them?
Demanded Clériveau, haughtily bending his brow.
"Thus,"
replied Justine, pointing through the dusk, now gathering round them, to the approaching figure of a man bending under the weight of a sack of meal, who, on putting down his burden and raising his head as he proceeded to wipe his streaming brows, presented to their view the homely features but prepossessing countenance of Valentin, while Charlet's son, startled to find his young master thus apparently domesticated with Mathurin and his daughters, yet in no wise daunted by his presence, cheerfully saluted the party.
What are you doing here, sir?
Demanded Felix in an angry voice.
Obeying the orders of the overseer, Monsieur Felix,
Replied the young man.
who bade me bring over... Is this a time for doing your mill work?
Interrupted Felix.
I shall represent tomorrow to my father that you defer the execution of his business till after hours, in order to suit your own whims and convenience. You will represent what you please, sir.
Answered Valentin.
But one honest man's word is as good as another's, and Monsieur Bernardin, the overseer, has known me too well from a boy upwards, as a truth-teller and fair dealer, not to credit my assurance that every minute of my morning's time was spent in my duty to my employer. If I have pushed the boat over to Le Tremblay to deliver to Monsieur Mathurin his meal this evening, instead of tomorrow morning as I was directed, it is only because I desire to offer him the bonsoir and my respects to the young ladies.
Your respects and your salutations are not wanted here, my lad.
Growled Mathurin.
If you had brought me the couple of crowns I have had to score up against your father for milk and meal furnished to your family, you would have done something more to the purpose.
And Mathurin, excited by the desire of saying a vexatious thing to the pauper who had presumed to lift his eyes to his pretty Manette, renounced the generous intention of his better nature to make a free gift to the needy family of the overflowings of his cruise of plenty.
Do not fancy I am come empty-handed,
Said Valentin, mildly, but drawing up with conscious pride, as he tendered the payment of the 2 crowns to the more prosperous farmer. And Manette's heart beat till it was ready to burst her bosom, for joy that her lover was able to redeem himself from humiliation in his rival's presence.
If I have delayed thus long, Monsieur Mathurin, it is that grievous sickness has arisen in my family from the damps of the season. Monsieur Clériveau's workman having neglected to repair the roof of our hut according to his covenant. But remember that although the cost of drugs and doctors may have kept us in your debt, it has not caused me to break my word. I promised you payment at midsummer, and Saturday next is the eve of St. John.
Good, Valentin, good.
Replied Mathurin, jerking the money into his pocket and ashamed of the meanness into which he had been betrayed.
You are an honest lad, and I have naught to say against you in your way. But your way is not mine, and I do not intend to make it so. Henceforward I shall beg Monsieur Bernardin to choose some other of his mill lads to do what business may chance to stand between us, and charge my old friend Charlet to lay his injunctions on yourself not to be gadding about upon idle errands of evenings, or at least not upon premises of mine.
You have said enough, Master Mathurin,
Answered Valentin, involuntarily glancing towards the 2 girls, who stood overcome with grief and embarrassment, leaning on each other under the acacia trees.
I am well aware to whom I am indebted for this sudden change of welcome, and shall take an opportunity to thank the talebearer, who for some time past has been base enough to play the spy upon my actions. You lie,
Vociferated Felix, on whom the accusing looks of Valentin were now directed.
You lie like a dog. Coward that you are, in daring to use such words to me.
Cried the young man, suddenly smiting a violent blow upon his own breast.
When you know that I cannot raise my hand against you so long as the bread eaten by my family is provided by your father's wages. You have also their beggary to thank for screening your insolence from chastisement,
Said the contemptuous Felix.
and as you seem to be in no condition to play the hero, beware, in future, how you assume the braggart.
Valentin, dear Valentin,
Exclaimed Justine, throwing herself before young Clériveau to intercept the spring which she perceived Valentin on the point of making upon his person.
remember your poor mother, remember your sick sisters.
Let me go!
Cried he, struggling with the silent embrace of Manette, which not even her father's presence sufficed to check, when she saw her lover on the eve of rushing into violence, the inevitable source of ruin to himself and his family.
Let me go! Let me not live to have it said of me that I dared not defend myself against the insults of a villain.
Then, dashing forwards, and again as suddenly checking himself, he burst into tears and covered his face with his hands, while he exclaimed,
"He is right. I dare not strike him. I dare not lay hands on the son of the Miller of Corbeil. I was born too poor to indulge in the sense of justice and honour. The walls that shelter us are his father's walls. The food we eat springs from him. Father, mother, brothers, sisters. This is the hardest thing I have had to bear for your sake."
Never mind him, Valentin. Be of good cheer, dear, dear Valentin.
sobbed Manette, her sensitive nature excited to its utmost pitch of violence by his distresses.
Let him be as rich and as audacious as he will. I hold him but a dastard and a beggar. From me he will obtain nothing, Valentin, nothing but scorn and detestation. Poor as you are, so poor will I be. Despise you as they may, I honour you, I revere you, I love you. My father may drive me forth, my friends disown me, but they have urged me on into defiance by their misdoings towards you. Valentin, dear Valentin, hear me, hear your wife, and leave this man to the rebukes of his own conscience.
Sad was the scene that ensued upon this open violation of parental authority. But Valentin had not the affliction of seeing the woman he loved savagely treated by her enraged father. For while Mathurin was engaged in driving back his daughter to the farm and locking her into her chamber, Felix and himself were entwined in a deadly struggle. A struggle that left him for a few seconds breathless and senseless on the turf. For the athletic Clériveau was as much the superior of the ill-nourished, over-tasked Valentin in personal strength as in worldly endowments. Young Baptiste, a hind employed upon the farm, attracted to the spot by the tumult of the scuffle, proceeded to raise him from the ground, while Felix hastily made off towards Corbeil. But when Valentin recovered the effects of his stunning fall sufficiently to comprehend what had passed, and to feel that he had been engaged in an altercation with his master's son, which would probably end in the ruin of his whole household, he wrung his hands for very bitterness.
"Would that I were dead,"
he ejaculated as he took his way back to his father's ferry-boat.
"Mathurin has sworn to bestow his daughter upon another. Monsieur Clériveau will eject my mother from her habitation when he learns what has occurred. My intemperance will seal the fate of my family without obtaining me the hand of Manette. Would that I were dead. Better be in my grave than thus a burden to myself and all the world."
"Be of good cheer, Valentin,"
cried the lad Baptiste, who had followed him and was aiding him to unmoor his boat.
"Mademoiselle Manette loves you in spite of them all. Mademoiselle Manette has promised that she will one day be your wife."
No, no wife, no house, no hope, no rest. I was born with the curse of God upon my soul,
uttered the ferryman's son, looking up to the sky where the faint flashes of a summer storm were already streaming, as if in impious reproach to the Omnipotent, who had created a wretch so miserable.
I was born to eat the bread of toil and bitterness. What matters it that such an outcast should cease to live?
And it came to pass that every petulant word uttered by Valentin to the farm lad Baptiste during that brief colloquy was eventually inscribed in the judicial archives of the country, with the view of throwing light upon the incidents following the quarrel of that fatal night. Old Charlet's son never again set foot upon the turf of Le Tremblay. Valentin was mistaken, however, in supposing that his dispute with Felix would ensure his dismissal from the Mill of Corbeil. Either old Clériveau saw no cause for displeasure in his conduct, or Felix had generously, or perhaps discreetly, forborne to prefer a complaint against him. When, at the ringing of the work bell the following morning, he presented himself as usual among the men, not a word of remark was made on the subject by Bernardin, the overseer. Valentin had been cutting rushes on the river from earliest daylight in order to repair, to the best of his own abilities, the dilapidated roof of the hovel from whence he so much dreaded to witness the ejection of his family. And, heart-sick with labour and fasting, he was scarcely able to support the struggle of his feelings on ascertaining that his rashness had not been the means of immediate injury to his sick and feeble mother. In the course of the day, he had still stronger evidence that no displeasure existed against him in the mind of the Clériveaux, for, a trustworthy messenger being needed to carry over to L'Abri the copy of a contract of sale for signature to one of the most extensive corn growers of the district, Valentin was chosen for the office, the usual factor being absent on pressing business at the market of Melun. Having received his instructions, he accordingly departed, and, as it was held impossible for him to return to Corbeil till a late hour at night, it was settled that he should tender an account of his commission to Monsieur Bernardin the following morning, when he was to be at the mill half an hour previous to his usual time. At that usual time, however, the work bell rang, but no Valentin made his appearance, and the young men in Clériveaux's employment began to joke among themselves, swearing that the sober Valentin must have been guilty of some excess and detained on the road. At a late hour, Bernardin dispatched one of the boys to Charlet's cottage to make inquiries, but still no Valentin had been heard of. Before evening they knew all, but the all was indeed no trivial matter. Before evening, the public authorities were summoned, and a procès-verbal was drawn up, specifying the finding of the body of the unfortunate Valentin suspended by his own handkerchief to a tree in the forest of Sénart. He had destroyed himself. It was noticed with sympathy by all that throughout the investigation of the case, young Clériveaux, who could not but tax himself as the unintentional cause of the misfortune, was pale as death and completely overpowered by his feelings. But if Felix sorrowed for the departed, what was the affliction of her whom he had so dearly loved, of those who so dearly loved him? What the agony of Manette, when she knew that he for whom she would have sacrificed all had incurred the guilt of the suicide? She did not hold him guilty, except, indeed, in leaving her behind to struggle alone with the troubles of the world. And as soon as the daylight dawned, on the day succeeding that when the body of Valentin was discovered in the forest, and, after the usual forms, deposited by the maréchaussé of Corbeil in his father's hovel previously to interment, she set out alone for Charlet's cottage to comfort the living, to mourn over the dead. It was a grievous sight, that miserable hut, standing alone in the midst of the green meadows on the borders of the Seine, like a thing abandoned to the mercy of nature, that miserable hut, whose prop was now reft away, that refuge for those who had none left to succour them, none left to minister to their wants, or wipe away their tears. Mathurin's daughter lifted the latch as gently as though it were possible that any under Charlet's roof could at such a season be sleeping, and with the calmness of despair entered the house of mourning. And mournful indeed was the spectacle. There, on the only pallet, lay the paralytic mother, hiding her face in the clothes, that she might not look upon the disfigured corpse of her firstborn, the mattress affording the customary bed to the children, having been already carried out and sold by the poor ferryman, to secure the means of a decent burial for his boy. And there the livid body of Valentin lay stretched upon the very rushes which his own hand had cut for so different a purpose, while his little brothers and sisters, deprived of their rest and terrified and hungry, were huddled together in a corner, staring with wonder at all that was passing. Charlet, usually so reckless amid his wants and misfortunes, sat with his head drooping on his breast, and scarcely raised his eyes on Manette's entrance. Nor was it till she went close up to him and kneeled at his feet and called him father, and reviled herself as the cause of the mischief which had happened, that the unhappy man seemed moved to consciousness.
"Had he lived, I should have been your daughter,"
said Manette, hiding her weeping face upon his knees.
And then all I had would have been yours. Accept it now, Charlet, for his sake.
She continued, placing in his hand a small bag containing the amount of her and Justine's earnings.
Accept it now, when it can be useful. For to me, worldly goods are henceforward vain.
And she wept long and bitterly, while the little children, who had been taught by Valentin to love her, crept forward and clung to her gown, and whispered to her to be comforted, for that their brother was surely with God.
"Yes, he is with God,"
said the broken-hearted old man in a hoarse voice.
"He whose loss renders these little ones worse than fatherless, and gives so bitter a pang to the poor grey-headed parents to whom he never gave pain before, must be with God. My boy may appear at the tribunal of grace with the stain of self-murder on his soul. He who never injured mortal man may have been moved to lift his hand against his own precious life. But heaven judges us not as we judge each other. Heaven witnessed the cares, the trials, the struggles of my blessed Valentin, and noted the maddening brain and breaking heart of the proud pauper, the tender son, the good brother, the good Christian, and heaven will forgive him."
Why did he forsake us?
Ejaculated Mathurin's daughter, rising from her knees and tottering towards the body.
Oh, Valentin, Valentin, why did you forsake me?
And lifting up the cloth with which the pious care of the father had covered the face of the dead, she imprinted a fervent kiss upon the lips of him who should have been her husband. At that moment, her father and sister, having missed her from the farm, and readily conjecturing her route, entered the cottage in search of Manette. But Mathurin's displeasure against the deceased was over now, and instead of expressing dissatisfaction at his daughter's proceedings, he not only advanced with tearful eyes to sprinkle holy water on the body of her ill-starred lover, but asked permission of Charlet to follow it to the grave. And when the remains of the warm and true Valentin were deposited in the pauper's trench of the churchyard of Saint-Germain, they were transported thither on the shoulders of his comrades, and followed by so vast a concourse of his fellow workmen and friends that the incense of their affliction was as that of a burnt offering, calculated to propitiate the mercy of God towards the suicide. It is probable that a catastrophe so lamentable would have produced a greater sensation and elicited a closer scrutiny in a little town so uneventful in its history as Corbeil, but that the still fiercer disasters of the French Revolution had already begun in the capital, and soon after, Felix secretly took his departure to join the armies of the Republic.
I knew it would be thus,
murmured the gentle Justine as she sauntered along the river walk of her father's garden, looking towards the Mill of Corbeil, when intelligence of young Clériveau's departure transpired in the town.
I was sure he could not remain here, haunting the same spots and communing with the same associates as before. He is right to fly. Felix has nothing more to do at Corbeil. His penance must be accomplished elsewhere. Miserable, miserable Felix! What thoughts, what recollections accompany him in his flight? What griefs, what terrors have been undermining his health? Yet Manette, who so dearly loved Valentin, has seen and suspected nothing of all this. While I, so long, so hopelessly devoted to Felix, discerned his conscience-struck affliction from the first moment I saw him gazing yonder from the shore on Charlet's hovel. The forest of Senart, the forest of Senart. Oh, that I could free myself from the imagination of that scene, that fatal, fatal night. No sooner am I left alone than involuntarily the whole black business rises before me. I fancy their encounter. I seem to hear their quarrel. I seem to see the struggle in which Valentin must have fallen a victim, ere the dreadful idea presented itself to Felix of making him pass for a self-murderer. Appearances avouched the imputation. Appearances deceived the officers of justice, deceived his comrades, his master, his father, his friends, his affianced wife. But they did not deceive me, for it was not on Valentin's life, but on the well-doing of Felix Cleriveau that my happiness was pledged. And oh, how have I watched over his repentance, his despair! Had he triumphed in his wickedness, I should have learned to hate him. But to see him self-convicted, penitent, wretched, although thrice secure from discovery. Miserable, miserable Felix! Driven from his home by the clinging curse of reminiscences henceforward to be attached to his birthplace. Oh, when will he venture to return to Corbeil?
Years rolled on. Old Cleriveau had already resigned the presidency of the mill to Bernardin, the overseer, and the fine domain of Saint-Germain having become national property by the emigration of the noble family with whom it was hereditary, the chateau was readily appropriated by the assignat of the Miller of Corbeil. Thither, with a scanty household, he retired, and there, uncared for and alone, falling gradually into a state of imbecility, it was a gratification to him, when tottering round the lawns, whose beauty he was incapable of appreciating, to be accosted by the younger daughter of his neighbour Mathurin, with inquiries whether tidings had reached him from his son, and how it fared with the armies of France. But the old man's answer was ever the same. The armies of France were triumphant, but no tidings from his son. Great names were beginning to arise from obscurity in the annals of the country. Lannes, Victor, Bernadotte, Murat, Duroc, Berthier, Suchet, Soult. A great soldier had conquered to its banners the eagle-plumed ensign of victory, but no conjecture enabled Cleriveau to discover under what designation Felix had either fallen on the field of honour or was struggling onwards in the career of fame. It was rumoured in the town that once, when a brigade, on its march to join the army of the Sambre and Meuse, halted at Essonne, a superior officer was seen galloping back to the high road in the dusk of the evening from the portal of the church of Saint-Spire, where, in the Tronc des Pauvres, adjoining the mausoleum of Count Haymon of Corbeil, a bank bill of considerable amount was found on the succeeding morning. But none could say that the stranger was Felix Cleriveau, and if indeed he, the sons of Egypt and Italy, had written strange defeature in his face. At length, it was at the triumphal epoch of the recognition of Le Soldat Heureux as first Emperor of France, the Miller of Corbeil, long, sickly and doting, was finally gathered to his rest, when a public advertisement, having been legally circulated by the authorities of the department, and the sale of the property subsequently announced, the heir, the long-absent, the half-forgotten Felix, appeared on the spot in the person of one of those eminent generals whose names had long been rife in the mouths of the inhabitants of Corbeil, and their destinies commended to heaven by the prayers of their fellow countrymen. But when, shortly afterwards, the equipage of General Le was seen one fine summer evening entering the iron gates of the park of Saint-Germain, the notion of the presence of one of the heroes of Marengo, of the pyramids, of Austerlitz, seemed to have superseded all recollection of Felix Cleriveau. The villagers gazed on the noble person of the handsome, grave, middle-aged soldier, whose head was more than slightly silvered by the toils of war, and saw no trace of the petulant youth they had been accustomed to watch 18 years before, crossing the river to Le Tremblay to laugh and jest with the roses of Corbeil. To his eyes, meanwhile, the season and the scene were much as when he quitted them. He had become a hero, a statesman. Europe was familiar with his name, and his voice had obtained weight in the councils of France. His port was now erect and stately, his step firm and measured, his voice stern and commanding. He had learned to control the desires and passions of others. He had learned to control his own. Nothing in him but was altered. But there rolled the same blue Seine, there smiled the same vineyards, there stood the Mill of Corbeil, there rose the woods of Saint-Germain, there the chimneys of the farm of Le Tremblay, There, far below in the meadows, crumbled the ruins of a hovel, the hut of the ferryman, and there, in the distant horizon, gloomed the forest of Senart. And lo, unsilenceably resounded in his ears the mandate, "Thou shalt do no murder." It was some comfort to him to learn that Mathurin was no more, and the family of Charlet the ferryman dispersed and forgotten.
"And the roses of Corbeil?"
inquired General Le, in a low voice, as, accompanied by the gamekeeper of Saint-Germain, on the evening of his arrival, he pursued his way along the terrace, gazing through the grey evening light upon the open country.
"Mathurin's elder daughter, mon général, she who married the young farmer named Baptiste, is the mother of 10 fine children and still living at the Tremblay," said the garde de chasse. "Her sister, Justine, poor soul, has become a sister of charity."
Hastily proceeding in their walk, the opening of the upper avenue of the chateau towards the vineyards brought them in sight of a fine, comely-looking countrywoman driving 2 cows, and accompanied by a lout of a farming boy and 2 healthy little girls with untrimmed heads and dirty faces.
"Tiens, voilà justement Mame Baptiste et ses enfants,"
continued the gamekeeper.
"Mame Baptiste! Hola, Mame Baptiste! Voici Monsieur le Général, qui s'informe de vous et de votre famille."
And General Le found himself perforce required to stand and receive the awkward courtesies of the great fat countrywoman before him, and listen to her history of her father's dying of an asthma and her own happy match with Baptiste, the cowboy.
Brave garçon, si jamais il en fut, et bien aime de ce pauvre Valentin. Monsieur le Général se rappelle sans doute ce pauvre Valentin?
Alas, what else but the remembrance of Valentin had kept him so long an alien from his father's hearth, so long an exile from home? And it was for the woman before him that he had borne so much, incurred so much, sinned so greatly, so irreparably. Poor, feeble human nature. Poor, murdered Valentin. But the trial thus voluntarily encountered proved too much for Felix, and after remaining a few hours longer at Saint-Germain, General Le quitted for the last time a spot abounding in soul-harrowing reminiscences, reminiscences rendering vain his toils of honor, his career of glory. For the brief remainder of his life, the fine mansion of Saint-Germain remained uninhabited, but the grave of General Le is now at Ehrenbreitstein, his monument in the Panthéon, and his property having been bequeathed to the foundation of a military hospital, otherwise invested. Strangers abide at the chateau. A company of speculators have assumed the direction of the Mill of Corbeil, and nothing remains to commemorate the past but the clear fountains of Le Tremblay and a deserted grave in the churchyard of the village of Saint-Germain, a grave whose accusing voice will be heard by the guilty soul even through the fearful timeless of eternity. Thank you for watching. As mentioned, this story comes from a small, leather-bound Franklin Library book entitled INISHAIRLACH, circa 1835, that include 3 other tales. This story is 12 pages long and does not make mention of the author. In fact, we are unable to find much information or history on this story. If you have any information, we hope that you will let us know in the comments below, or just let us know where you are watching from. Please feel free to like this video and subscribe for future videos.